Good morning, Asia. Hello, world. It's a Tuesday. Glad you could join us for another action-packed edition of Asia Business Report. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. We start off with the U.S. government, and it has granted the Chinese telecoms giant a dramatic 3-month reprieve. A temporary license has been issued, which delays widespread restrictions until August. They were announced last week and effectively block Huawei out of the world's biggest economy. And that has led Google to cut Huawei's access to its Android smartphone operating system. And it's all because the U.S. is concerned that Huawei helps the Chinese government spy, something the company has always denied. Our correspondent Michelle Fleury in New York has more details on this temporary license.
Well, the U.S. Commerce Department, Rico, on Monday created a temporary general license, restoring Huawei's ability to maintain existing networks and to provide software updates to existing Huawei handsets. What that means, in essence, is that some companies that are already interacting with Huawei on a day-to-day basis, for example, networks in rural areas of the United States that had Huawei infrastructure in place, well, they can continue doing so until at least August. That's when this extension expires. Now, this was something that was expected. It doesn't appear to change the state of play with, say, Google, but it does raise questions about how these restrictions that have been imposed by the US government will be implemented on a day-to-day basis, given in some cases how embedded Huawei technology is into the supply chain here in the United States.
What has been the reaction from the markets?
Well, when we first started to hear that news about Google essentially dumping Huawei, you saw a sharp reaction on the financial markets, the Dow Jones opening in negative territory. I can tell you that at the end of the day, stocks, well, they were still down, perhaps not as bad as they had been at certain points during the day. I think if you go through an individual company by company basis, certainly amongst the hardest hit is the semiconductor sector. They are particularly vulnerable in the supply chain. Many of them do business with Huawei, and so as a result of that, they are amongst the stocks that you're seeing hardest hit by this. I think investors are getting nervous. They're starting to work out the costs involved in this sort of broadening scope of America's ongoing trade dispute and ongoing dispute and national security concerns with Huawei, and the knock-on effect is that you're seeing U.S. company share prices being impacted.
And that was my colleague and business reporter from New York, Michelle Fleury. So what do all of these restrictions mean for your smartphone and for the telecommunications industry? For his views, we're joined now by Jake Saunders, Managing Director at the tech consultancy company ABI Research. Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
So, this latest reprieve, does it help Huawei or does it still spell trouble for them?
Well, actually, what this really does help is the rural mobile operators in America. AT&T, Verizon, they don't use Huawei equipment, but there are some small, what are called sort of mom and pop mobile operators in the hinterland of America which do have Huawei equipment. Imagine they were probably up in arms and concerned having to better turn off that Huawei equipment. But in terms of the other side of Huawei's business, the business that grew 45% last year, that represents $52 billion. The handset business, that dramatic situation hasn't changed.
So why implement the ban and then give them a 3-month temporary license?
Well, then the temporary license, I think, relates to the executive order last week. I think that's where it relates to. It's hot off the press news. I can't be
absolutely sure. And that's how the Trump administration works, the carrot and the stick.
I think so. I think there's got that sort of duality there where they're trying to sort of move forward the discussions in the US-China trade war.
But it's not all about Huawei in the tech ecosystem, because by banning Huawei, giving them restrictions, affects everyone else.
Well, I mean, last year was ZTE. So last year, because of some of the sanction busting that ZTE been involved in, they were almost brought down to their knees last year. But that was resolved. A fine was paid, I think it was about $1 billion, and that situation resolved, and ZTE is on the upswing. Huawei is now being the target this year, but yes, there are other Chinese vendors. Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, all these vendors probably represent about 45%, maybe 50% of the entire handset market.
But will these competitors of Huawei, the likes of Oppo and Xiaomi and Lenovo, benefit from these restrictions by the US government against Huawei, or will they eventually be all lumped together?
mean, they may benefit in the short term, but the longer term, they've got to be concerned about their position. And you've got to wonder, perhaps, is the Chinese government going to try to get them into a sort of collective bargaining position, perhaps with the likes with Google, and put some pressure upon Google, because this must be a major part of the revenue stream feeding into Google.
But with this problem between Google now and Huawei, will this accelerate Huawei's development of its operating system?
Well, they do have an operating system, which they have in their back pocket. But the fundamental reality is that's not really the big issue. We've had previous operating systems. I mean, Linux is a classic operating system. Android is based upon Linux. But the real issue is the App Store. And the Google Android App Store has just got so many apps. And to get all those developers to port over those apps to another app store, it can be done, but it's a slow process.
This will surely impact Huawei's smartphone business. Thank you so much for joining.